We now move to our second and final special presentation this evening. Mayor Tim Greimel presenting about what we know so far of Oakland County's pursuing the purchase of some office towers in downtown Pontiac, the Ottawa Towers. Mayor Greimel, you have the floor.
Thank you, President McGinnis. I want to start by talking a little bit about the history of the Phoenix Center for those who may not be super familiar with it. I think most people in the community are quite familiar with at least some of the basics, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got to the present day. And then I want to talk about this agreement that Oakland County has entered into with a private property owner. So the Phoenix Center was constructed, at least officially that construction was completed back in 1981. And so a little over 40 years ago, the Phoenix Center construction was completed. That allowed for the construction of both the two office towers known as Ottawa Tower and Judson Tower, as well as the parking deck itself, and ultimately the facilitation of events, especially concerts, on top of that parking structure. Around that same time, Phoenix Center Apartments was constructed on the east side of the Phoenix Center as well. Fast forward in time to the emergency management era, and during the emergency management era, by that time the parking garage had not been particularly well maintained, but was still being used as parking for the adjacent office towers. The emergency manager made a decision at that time to not do any maintenance or other upkeep on the Phoenix Center parking garage, and ultimately closed the Phoenix Center parking garage, at least to public parking, and to a large extent even to private parking for the occupants of those office towers. That occurred back in 2011-ish timeframe when the emergency manager made those decisions. The emergency manager also at that time sought to demolish the parking structure, and the owner of the office towers at that time, which by that time were owned by some LLCs or other corporate entities owned by the Stevens family, commenced a lawsuit against the emergency manager and against the city of Pontiac, saying that the city couldn't demolish the parking structure because the office towers needed it for parking, and that they had a right to continue to park in it, and it was the city's obligation to maintain the parking structure to facilitate that parking for the office towers. That litigation dragged out for a really long time, almost 8 years between the emergency management era and the era of elected leadership in the city under the previous mayor. The previous mayor entered into a settlement agreement with the Stevens family, and that settlement agreement required the city to make a huge amount of investment into the Phoenix Center to maintain and improve the Phoenix Center. That maintenance and improvement, that investment of funds by the city was required under that settlement agreement to occur by a certain date. And as that date approached, the city had not made those investments in the Phoenix Center. And the city then, in an effort to avoid the ramifications of not abiding by that settlement agreement, then orchestrated a very complicated real estate deal by which the city, again, this was all before this council was in office, was before I was in office, but under the previous mayor and the previous city council, the city bought the office towers from the Stevens family and the entities that they controlled, and then sold it the very same day to a separate private entity at about a $6 million loss. And that loss was manifested by the city at that time agreeing to pay the previous owners, the Stevens family who had sold it, about $6 million over the coming years. And in exchange for that, the new buyer of the office towers was expected and required to make all of the needed improvements to the Phoenix Center parking garage. The city at the same time gave that private entity that bought Ottawa Towers a 99-year lease to the parking garage. So all of this happened before the 8 of us, the 7 council members up here, and me were in office. So fast forward a little bit further, because all of that happened about 2.5 years ago now, 2.5 years ago to be exact. And the current owner of the office towers has not made the requisite improvements to the parking garage. The Judson Tower, which once upon a time had been occupied by GM, is now vacant and has been vacant for a very long time. So it's completely vacant. Ottawa Tower is mostly occupied today, mostly by the State Department of Health and Human Services, although there are some other tenants in the Ottawa Tower as well. So the county has entered into a purchase agreement to buy the office towers from the current private owner. That purchase agreement would also mean that the city is assuming, that the county is assuming this 99-year lease that the owner of those private office towers has with the city. So this purchase agreement is between the county and the private owner of the office towers. The city is not a party to that purchase agreement, and that purchase agreement does not involve or entail the city selling any city-owned property. I want to be really clear about that. The county, under that purchase agreement, would buy the 2 office towers, and as I said, also assume the 99-year lease from the city. So the implications of all that are that the county would move county employees into the Judson Tower, and the county has estimated that they would move somewhere between 400 and 600 county employees into that vacant office tower of Judson, which is off of Judson Street. It would have to make a decision about what it does with Ottawa Tower, and it would also have to make a decision about, together with the city, about what it wants to do with the Phoenix Center. If it simply took on the lease to the Phoenix Center parking garage, it would have this 99-year lease, but it would also be stepping into the shoes of the private owner in terms of that private owner's obligations to make millions of dollars worth of investments and improvements to the parking garage. The city, as I said, although there are lots of implications for the city, including some financial implications for the city, because the city, unfortunately, is still paying off this roughly $6 million of debt that the previous mayor left us with, there are lots of financial implications to the city of this deal and development implications for downtown Pontiac, including the potential moving of 400 to 600 county employees from way out on Telegraph, adjacent to the border of Waterford, to the heart of our downtown, which really, by the way, not only would infuse some new life into our downtown by having more office employees in the downtown who would be frequenting restaurants and retail establishments, which would certainly be an injection of additional vitality and life into the downtown. But it would also bring the county back into the heart of our downtown for the first time in over 60 years, which is when the county moved its offices out of the whole core and heart of our downtown out to this sort of middle of nowhere place out on Telegraph right across the street from Waterford. And by the way, Brooks Patterson, when he was county executive, added insult to injury to that move by moving the county executive's office across Telegraph into Waterford. So for a number of years now, about 10 years or so, the county executive's office has not been in the county seat, Pontiac, but actually in Waterford because of that additional move that Brooks Patterson made. So there are, I think, some really exciting positives to the county's proposal, including injecting, 400 to 600 employees in the heart of our downtown, bringing Oakland County back to its roots in the heart of our city. But a lot of some of the additional details here have to be worked out. The county is seeking a little over $85 million from the state for assistance in renovating Judson Tower in particular, although the county also wants to use some of those funds for renovating Ottawa Tower. And then additional funds could be used either for renovating the Phoenix Center, because the county, assuming this 99-year lease, would be on the hook to make renovations there, or alternatively to demolish the Phoenix Center and build a new parking garage or a new amphitheater. But anything that affects the parking garage or the amphitheater in terms of demolition or sale would have to be approved by City Council, because there's nothing about what the county is seeking to do with the private owners that affects the city's ownership of the parking garage. The previous mayor leased the parking garage to the private owner for 99 years, but the city still owns the parking structure. So there's nothing about the county's deal and the county's purchase agreement that it signed with the private owner that affects any of the city's ownership interests in anything, including the parking structure. And so anything that the county might do to seek to demolish the parking structure or alter the terms of the lease with the parking structure would all have to be approved by the city, including the City Council. So I want to be really clear about that. And the agreement that the county has entered into with the private owners of the towers does not affect the city's ownership interest in the Phoenix Center. It also, at least in and of itself, wouldn't do anything to ameliorate the city's $6 million debt to the Stevens family, which up until 2.5 years ago owned those office towers. Now, one of the things that we have argued is if the state provides a bunch of assistance to the county in connection with this deal, we are arguing to legislators that some of those funds should be used to pay off that $6 million of debt that the city was left with and has been saddled with. So I've already started having that conversation with legislators and others, because it's very important that that unfair burden that the city, and by extension all of you as taxpayers and residents, have been saddled with gets resolved if the county is successful in getting assistance from the state. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Mayor Stevens to really walk through what the county's purchase agreement with the private owner does and what it doesn't do, and what our options and what the possibilities are moving forward as we seek to leverage this opportunity for the improvement of our downtown and for the betterment of all of Pontiac's residents. So with that, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. The mayor actually went through the entire presentation, but there are a couple of things that I will point out. For those of you who don't know, the areas that we are talking about are highlighted here. Items 1 and 2 are the 2 office towers. Item 3 is the parking garage itself with the amphitheater on top. Item 4, which a lot of people conflate with the 2, is Lot 9. Lot 9 is not part of this deal. It is owned by a separate entity completely. But because of its presence and because of its use as parking, a lot of people think that it is part of the Phoenix garage, but it is not.
And if I could interject, Deputy, I do just want to amplify that point. The Lot 9 is owned by a separate individual by the name of Gary Warner, who happens, coincidentally or not, to be the son-in-law of Brooks Patterson, and the emergency manager at the time, going back 10 or so years, sold Lot 9 to that individual. Just FYI. I think many members of the community are aware of that. Others are not. But we would love to seek to bring Lot 9 back under public ownership. It should have never been sold in the first place. Go ahead, Deputy.
And then, of course, you can see the proximity of all of that to the City Hall grounds. Here's just a closer picture showing, again, items 1 and 2, which are the Ottawa Tower and Judson Tower, and the garage itself. And again, the mayor already went through the facts of the case. Oakland County has proposed to buy the office towers, and they would assume the 99-year lease. They have asked the state of Michigan for $85 million to help with the renovation, and this again does not include Lot 9, which is under separate ownership. Again, one of the towers is mostly full. The other tower is completely vacant. Oakland County estimates between 400 to 600 people will be moved down here. There have been talks, well, actually not even talks. It has been said, hey, would the city of Pontiac like to move into those towers? Beyond that thrown out, nothing has been discussed. There have been no tours. There has been no discussion as to cost or price, or will there even be space left over after Oakland County decides what they want to do with the buildings? And then finally, the county, from the time that this was announced, they have a 60-day due diligence period to determine whether or not they will close on the deal. So the important thing on this slide, that very first bullet point, in 2016, the Congress for New Urbanism worked with the city to do a charrette to determine what should happen in all of the downtown. And specifically at the parking garage site, they determined that the best use of that property would actually be to demolish and rebuild the garage. And actually, they believe that it can be demolished in phases as something new was put in its place. And that is largely considering the fact of the amount of neglect that had been given to the garage at that time. And now we fast forward, another 7 years from the time of that study, and even more neglect has gone forward. The rest of the bullet points we have gone over again, that at the end of the day, nothing has been determined as to will the garage be demolished and rebuilt? Will the garage be refurbished? Will Oakland County even move through with closing on the deal? None of that is known at this time. And that is the end of the presentation.
All right, I'm going to allow everyone the opportunity to have question and feedback. I'm just going to go in the row. So, Councilman Rutherford, first up.
Thanks.
And then we could do multiple rounds if need be. Councilman Rutherford.
Mayor Greimel, in the Cranes Business Detroit article, there was a statement made by Dave Coulter, and then on Friday we got a letter saying that he will retract that statement. Number one, has that been done? And then number two, in the Detroit News Free Press, speaking Detroit News at 7:29 p.m. yesterday, Dustin McClellan, who's a part of your transition team, made the same type of similar statement. The question is, how are we going to stop the conversation that we've already been in agreement when the two people who have said it have already keep saying it's a narrative? So that's where the confusion is coming, because the statement was made and then it was made again yesterday. I yield to the mayor.
Yeah, this is the first I've heard of Dustin McClellan's statement, so I'll talk offline with you about that. Obviously, my transition is long over, so Dustin no longer has any formal association with the city. So we can talk offline about what he said. This is the first I'm hearing of that. But in terms of Dave Coulter, the county executive, Dave Coulter, was not quoted in that Cranes article, but the Cranes article did say that it paraphrased and said Dave Coulter had said that. And that surprised me. I know from a phone call that I had with Dave Coulter that it surprised Dave Coulter. And Dave Coulter's press secretary, is my understanding, has demanded a retraction and correction from Cranes. I will defer to our communications director, Paula Bridges, about whether or not that retraction and correction has occurred on the part of Cranes.
Right, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. I have been in touch with the reporter directly asking for that retraction, asking for the editor at Cranes to retract that, because in listening to the tape and going over our notes, it was very adamantly described that the county would take over the lease. Early this morning, I had a message that was left by the reporter asking me to give that person a call. I did. I reached out to the reporter. I sent an email. I sent an email to the editor. At this point, I'm not certain if that has been made, but we have reached out diligently over the last couple of days to have that retraction made. And so I will make it, again, my purpose to find out as soon as possible when that can be done.
Councilman Nicholson?
My question's specifically about the insurance claim for the damage to the awning. So I know there was a lot of money that went into taking down the tattered pieces. Have those funds been received at this point, and how will they be accounted for going forward?
Great question. Those funds have not been received. They only have not been received because the city has not determined exactly how we want to go forward with the claim. Do we want to use the funds to remove the entirety of the structure, or do we want to use the funds to replace the structure as was, or do we want to use the funds to put a new awning up that is designed differently? And so once we let the insurance company know what our intent is, then we will finish the claim.
Councilman Goodman?
So the thing I have to say is less of a question, more of a thing to worry about going forward, which is as we bring in the county into downtown proper, which I believe that they should have always been. They should have been in Pontiac. They should have never left. I think collectively we recognize that that's just a common sense thing that was arguably done for the many different political reasons. The thing I want to make sure that we're doing in the possible finalization of this deal, that we make sure that in bringing this nice shiny new thing, that we make sure that we're prioritizing like real community development for people who are already here, because this is a way to open up the door towards gentrification that happens parallel to obvious good economic and community development. And so as we bring in the county and we bring all these new employees, which obviously means that there is renewed investment in our city, I want us to make sure that we're like prioritizing the people who are not only here, but we're as we're doing this development, it's not just in downtown, because these people will obviously come to downtown. But as we're redeveloping the entirety of the city, we need to make sure that the city as a whole is really benefiting and, again, being prioritized as we do the shiny new thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I strongly agree.
Pro Tem Carrington?
Yes. Thank you, President McGinnis. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the mayor for the presentation. It's very important that we continue to be straight and forward concerning this particular deal. I know it's been a lot of Facebook chatter, social media chatter, so I just want to make sure that we continue to make sure we're putting out the correct information to the community. I think it's very important for this administration as well as council to get this particular situation situated. This is something that we did inherit, a very awful situation. So I think we got a great opportunity to make sure we correct this and make sure we put the community first. That's it.
Councilwoman James?
Yeah, first of all, I just am dumbfounded that listening to the mayor's presentation, that it sounds like we are, and we being the city of Pontiac, the only part of that whole settlement agreement that actually began to do what the settlement agreement called for, because no one else did what the agreement called for. The city of Pontiac is paying the $6 million to the owners of the previous owners of the Ottawa Tower. In the years since the agreement, not one bit of work has been done on that on the Ottawa Tower. So that amazes me that you have a legal agreement and the only people that are keeping it, only parts of the agreement that are being made are City of Pontiac. Anyway, as far as the presentation and this proposal that has been made by Oakland County, I think essentially it's a good proposal. I can recall, I think, before COVID hit, that there was a informal survey done, and the City of Pontiac residents were about 50-50 on whether they wanted to see that demolished or whether they wanted to do something with it. But with the passing of time, I think that it probably is past the age where we would want to try to really hold on to it anymore. So I don't think it's a bad proposal. I'm concerned, though, as to how it came up, and I would very much like to see these kinds of projects that have such a huge dimension for the city, that I'd love to see them have a little more conversation at the community level, before they hit cranes and all of a sudden everybody's talking about something that, as residents of Pontiac, we knew nothing about. So I'd like to see us have a little more involvement in this. And my question is, I'm trying to understand if the Oakland County's proposal, their agreement to purchase those Ottawa towers, is that proposal contingent upon the fact that we are in fact going to vote to allow the Phoenix Center to be demolished? Is that what the assumption is, that they will purchase these two towers, but with the assumption that they will also be able to demolish the Phoenix Center? In other words, do these two go together, is what I'm trying to understand.
Mayor Brown.
Well, I want to try to, I'll answer the last question, but I want to try to answer some of the implicit questions that you've raised first, and then I'll answer the last question. So in terms, I think you were alluding early on to whether the owner of Ottawa Towers has made the investments in terms of improvements and maintenance to the parking garage as required under the lease of the parking garage. And the answer is, I think the answer is pretty clearly no from a common sense standpoint. They've done some things in the parking garage, so I want to be clear about that. It's not the case that they've done nothing, but they certainly have not made the scope and scale of improvements that was contemplated a couple of years back, 2.5 years ago. But I think one of the challenges, as I've consulted with the city's attorneys about that, going back to last year, is that the agreement was not very clearly written on behalf of the city. It's not that clear exactly what the improvements are that have to be made, and it's not at all clear what the city's recourse is if those improvements are not made on the timeline that they're supposed to be made. So it's put the city in a difficult position in terms of trying to enforce that aspect of the agreement because it was not well written on behalf of the city. So I just wanted to address that point. The other point that you made is the fact that the county's negotiations with the current private owner of the office towers were not made public, and that this only became public after the county and the private owner signed a purchase agreement. That's almost always the case in real estate transactions because it's very hard to negotiate, just in general, it's hard to negotiate a deal with it being out in the public. So the county actually used a third party to negotiate this deal. So the seller of the office towers didn't even know that they were negotiating with the county, because had they known that, they probably would have jacked up the price for the county. And so the county used a third party to negotiate this deal with the private seller. So that's how under wraps the county was keeping this, just to be clear. So it wasn't just the members of the public or Pontiac's residents who weren't aware of the details of this, but even the private owner of Ottawa Towers, even the seller, didn't know all the details or know that the county was buying this. So I also wanted to just be clear about that. And third, the deal that the county has entered into with the private owner to buy the towers and to assume the lease is not contingent on the Phoenix Center being demolished. So I want to be really clear about that. There has been some conversation on the part of the county about them thinking that's probably what makes the most sense moving forward, but I haven't, the city hasn't agreed to demolish it. The county's acquisition of the towers from the private owner is not contingent on that happening. And I think the biggest variable, as I said, is, well, how much funding does the state provide? And then depending on what that amount is, then the county and the city both, including and especially city council, will have to make a decision about what the best use of those dollars is moving forward.
Councilman Parker?
Thank you, Brother President. You know, there's a lot of words thrown around this evening, and there's a lot of pieces that seems to be still undecided, and nobody knows what's going to happen. It seems to me that the real issue here, though, is trust. From day one, even with the last administration, if I recall, the reason that the deal that they made was put in place was because we was about to foreclose on another deal that was not getting done correctly, and that administration had to do something to keep from going, as it was presented, back into the possibility of an emergency management situation. That's how we ended up in the 99-year deal, as I recall. And so now we in the 99-year deal, and only somebody that seems to be doing anything with the 99-year deal is the city, who's trying to faithfully pay or do what they promised they would do, and nobody else has done anything. And I'm curious because I do recall we had a legal company, and we have legal representatives now, and you're telling me that we can't say you had an obligation, we've been keeping our end of the bargain, why aren't you keeping your end of the bargain? With all this money that we send out for legal representation, I could have did that just with a little piece that I know. So there seems to be just, people are just, seems to be playing with people's, well, let me put it this way. Pontiac ain't stupid. And Pontiac is getting tired of hearing the misinformation, disinformation, and just lack of lies that everybody's telling about a deal. If I recall, I don't know how much of it was done in private and in secret, and I don't know how much could have been done in private and in secret, because I do know loose lips sink ships, and I know loose lips can mess up a deal. But at some point, we're going to have to address the preponderance of lack of trust in this administration, the last administration, and this administration, if we ever expect to be able to move this city anywhere close to where it needs to be. Thank you.
Councilman Rutherford?
Just point of clarity to the mayor. When did the council find out about the selling and the purchase of the sale?
Yeah, so the purchase agreement was signed by the county and the private owner on May 17th, and the council and the mayor, me, met in closed session on May 18th to discuss the potential budgetary implications of that deal, including the $6 million in debt that the previous administration left the city, as well as other potential financial implications and budgetary implications to the city.
And so my follow-up is, so prior to that, we had no knowledge of this deal, correct?
Council did not, that's right.
Thank you.
Councilman Nicholson?
So if we're talking about $6 million, what was the ramification if this deal wasn't entered to by the taxpayers? It was how many millions of dollars?
You mean the deal that the previous administration and
if
previous
it-
council?
Correct. If we were to have
entered
been
into?
found in default by the courts, what was the tax liability for the residents?
I don't feel like I can intelligently speak to that because I haven't looked in the rearview mirror as to what would have happened 2.5 years ago under a previous administration. So I don't know. I've heard varying and different reports and perspectives on that from members of the last council, from the previous mayor, from members of the public. So I don't know the answer.
I recall it being quite a hefty sum. I just want to, I want to say, you know, what could have and should have and is now is, I think, where we're sitting now, right? And where we're sitting now is the 6 million. Other minds and other people may have made other choices, but they're at the end of we were at the end of the clock was running to the very end. So I will certainly say I don't agree with where we ended up and the deal that we got, but I, you know, want to say it's difficult to understand where I would have been as a taxpayer thinking, you know, if it were this or it were that, what do you do? You know, I mean, I can't imagine being in this seat and having to make that decision at that point if that was the only thing that was on the table. So I also want to say that if there are additional updates that need to be made, I'm certainly with Pastor Parker. I wonder the financial implication we were in before when we were sorting out this mess and the amount of money that the city spent before, that sum too would make me sweat. So to stay out of that potential, you know, ramification, I think, you know, I'd have to consider really with legal counsel what would be our best way forward. And I don't think the council has asked that question or gotten that answer. But I know the public has asked that before, so it could be something that they could give us an opinion on. I think we would all be interested in that.
Councilman Goodman? I do want to point out that I appreciate the administration having the pass, if you will, the Phoenix Center roadway cleaned recently. That's a boost. So right now, it is the city's responsibility for the roadway that goes underneath the Phoenix Center. So if you see something, a new pothole that is formed, et cetera, at least as presently stands, that is city responsibility. Mayor Greimel, is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, it is. So the roadway itself, the Auburn Orchard Lake roadway, is the city's responsibility. However, I'll just also note that one of the challenges in terms of trash along there is that there's a lot of trash inside the Phoenix Center that then blows into the roadway. So the roadway is our responsibility as city government, but cleaning up the trash in the Phoenix Center is the Phoenix Center lessee's responsibility, which is still a private entity, because that won't change unless and until the county closes on the purchase of the office towers and on the assumption of the lease.
I do want to make sure that whatever comes in the future years or decades to come, it makes sense that we have a gathering place in the downtown. You know, there's logistical and financial challenges to it being a few stories up. That's part of the reason why there hasn't been the active utilization of that public space, is because of elevator challenges and electricity challenges that make the accessibility of it an issue. But whether it is a few stories in the sky or at ground level in the future, city property and public property that has a gathering place, a performance space, has that amphitheater benefit, has great value, civic value, and I think that downtown and the entire community would be the stronger for it. We have a lot of vicinity around these towers in the Phoenix Center that looks rough, that is not, you know, up to the standards that Pontiac residents deserve. And there's a lot of challenges to that, in part because Lot 9 is now privately owned. The lots on Water Street are now privately owned. The buildings on Judson and South Saginaw, those are privately owned. So we are basically have this concrete sea around us that what we can do right now is enforce, make sure the code is upheld, that if there is debris or, you know, profanities that are sprayed on it, we can try and very quickly make sure that those private property owners can tackle it. We welcome further feedback in the meantime, But what is there right now is not sustainable. And I look forward to, however this shakes out, that we get a better outcome for residents, better curb appeal, and just something that's useful. It has in the past been useful. I want it to be useful again. And so that's where I'm looking for, is what's the most cost-effective and long-lasting usefulness. I wish things last longer. I wish that when things were built in 1981, that they made some different decisions so that way they were a little more practical, that we could have, been able to sustain it. But I recognize that we can't go back time machine-wise. Pro Tem Carrington, other questions or feedback?
No, I pass.
Councilwoman James?
No.
Councilman Parker?
I did have.
Microphone?
I'm sorry. I did have a question about Judson Tower, but I think I'll ask it offline, and so I pass.
Councilman Rutherford?
When is the closing date for this proposed deal?
I actually don't know the deadline to close. I know that there's a 60-day due diligence period, which suggests that the county would have to pull out of the deal, at least without losing its earnest money, within 60 days of May 17th, which would be, sometime in mid-July.
July 6th.
But I don't know. Typically, the due diligence period expires, and then there's additional time when the closing would actually have to occur. So I would guess just, sometime within another 30 to 60 days after the due diligence period expires. But I don't actually know the answer offhand.
Thank you.
Councilman Nicholson?
If the public wanted to access the global settlement agreement to read that for themselves, is that accessible? How would they get that material?
Yeah, we can certainly, you're talking about the settlement agreement from 2001, from 2000, from November-ish of 2000 that the previous mayor and previous council entered into. We can certainly make that available for folks. That's not some.
You saying 2000?
I think that's what Councilman Nicholson is asking about.
I want, its current document, I think would be what.
Oh, and I'm sorry, did I say 2000? I'm sorry, I meant 2020 I think that's what you're.
Correct.
Thank you,
Yep.
Council President. But that's what you're asking about, right?
Correct.
Councilman Nicholson. So, yeah, the settlement agreement that was entered into in 2020, we can certainly make that available, including potentially online if council thinks that would be valuable to the public.
Yeah, I think it would be. There's just so much that comes from the public that says this is what the deal was or what was agreed to, and I just want to make sure that people can read it for themselves.
Yeah, I have no problem with that.
Thank you.
On a related note, a member of the public has requested in writing a copy of whatever there are agreements between the city of Pontiac and Oakland County related to this purchase. Is it correct to say that there is no such document? There's no agreement?
That's right. There is no such document. There is no agreement between the city and the county, period.
Councilman Parker?
Thank you, but you mentioned earnest money. How much has the county put up? Do you know? Nobody knows? The earnest money?
Don't quote me on it, but I think it's a couple $100,000. Again, we're not party to the agreement, so, but I believe that's what the county executive's office has said.
And and a follow-up question, and they're expecting to also get money from the state to the tune of $85 million?
Yeah, when I talk about the earnest money, I'm talking about the down payment, if you will, on the purchase. The purchase price, which would be exchanged at closing, is something in the order of $20 million, give or take. I think a little less than $20 million. Again, these are all in the agreement between the county and the private owner. The city is not party to any of this, which is why, I don't know the amounts that other private transactions not involving the city involve for other properties in the city either. But based on what the county executive has said, I believe it's a little less than $20 million is the purchase price, but only a tiny fraction of that is the earnest money that's paid up front when the purchase agreement is entered into.
Councilman Park? I'm done. Okay. Councilman Rutherford?
Point of information, it's $19.2 million. That's the price.
Any further final questions or discussion on this special presentation? All right. As there are future forks in the road or updates, we'll make sure that the community hears what we know. All right. Are there any elected officials wishing to give an update in their capacity as an elected official? All right. The chair of the Pontiac Charter Revision Commission, Tamika Ramsey, has the floor.